Now, the fatal shooting last month by police in Paris of 17-year-old called Nahel, who was of Algerian descent, has sparked rage and riots in the streets of France. But where did this rage come from? It's raised questions about France's attitude to race and how their colonial past fits into this picture. Considering Britain and France both have similar colonial experiences and waves of immigration from former colonies, have they approached multiculturalism differently, and how has it directly impacted on how minority communities feel and belong? With me to discuss these questions, we have French-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani, who lives between London and Paris, and Nasar Meer, Professor of Sociology at the University of Edinburgh. A very good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Lovely to have you with us. Now, Nabila, why do you think Nahel's death ignited this reaction? What's the sort of social landscape of these riots in the suburbs of Paris, Marseille, Lyon and beyond?
Well, it's first and foremost the brutal killing of a young boy by a police officer, an agent of the state, who shot him dead at point-blank range. And that's the basic answer to that. Mm-hmm. And the most complex answer is that this is, of course, the kind of shooting that exemplifies the hateful treatment by police officers of ethnic and religious minorities in France. So the Nahel's case illustrates everything that's wrong with how France deals with its ethnic minorities. And in essence, it still views them as second-class citizens. And that's why it takes an extreme case like Nahel's killing to unleash this kind of rage that we've seen before.
And when we look at that social landscape just now, Nabila, what has been brewing? Has this been building for some time? Have there been other incidents that have led to this, to the riots we see today?
Yes, indeed. It's not the first time that a young man from a North African or indeed an African background is shot by the police or indeed is brutalized by the police. Police brutality, violence in any shape or form, including racial profiling, meaning that if you are a black person or a person of North African heritage, if you're an Arab or Muslim, in other words, you are 20 times more likely to be stopped and searched by officials, law and authority officials. And that's according to France's own ombudsman on civil liberties. We've heard bodies like the United Nations say as much. France is regularly also criticized by the human rights courts for its treatments of minorities. And all this, and including, as you mentioned in your introduction, the colonial baggage plays into that. And erupts when instances like that happen.
Nabila, talk to me a bit more about the colonial history. What sort of historic context do we have to help understand some of these events?
Well, for example, the very forces of law and order that you see on the streets, the brutal paramilitaries who are equipped with machine guns and tear gas and batons, those forces were actually created at the height of the Algerian War of Independence in the late 50s and the early 60s. They are first and foremost colonial police forces that were created and aimed to keep particularly Algerians in check. All Algerians who lived on mainland France were seen as potential insurgents fighting for the liberation movement, aiming to liberate Algeria from its colonialism. And dare I say, Nanterre in particular has a historical significance. It was the site of the biggest shanty town in France, where up to 10,000 North African laborers were parked there with no running water or electricity. They were all considered as enemies of the state, and they were regularly subjected to extrajudicial killing, torture, and all sorts of violence. And this reached the climax in October 1960. 61, when 300 Algerians who were taking part in a peaceful march against, to ask for Algeria's independence, were murdered in central Paris by police, and many of them were hanged in trees in suburban woods, or they were thrown off bridges in central Paris with their bodies left to drown in the Seine River. So there is no doubt that this horrendous colonial history, which is within living memories, 61, and Algeria became independent in 1962. Yeah. So this heritage, if you like, this violent heritage legacy informs the troubles that are happening today, not least of all because nobody has been brought to justice in relation to those crimes in the 60s. And there's a sentiment, I've been in Nanterre all week covering the events, and there's a sentiment that Nahel's family won't get justice for his murder as well.
Well, it's a very relatively recent history as well, with Algeria only becoming independent in 62. Nasar, I'd like to bring you in here and ask, because, Britain, like France, was a colonial power that encouraged waves of migration from their former colonies. But is there something different in how they both went about integrating those communities, or even what they expected from them?
Yeah, very much so. As Nabila has indicated, some of this has to do with the continuity between then and now in terms of how people who migrated from the former colonies became members of the nation, became members of the state through its citizenship. And in the UK, there was always a great deal more flexibility in how people could reconcile the identities that they came with, their migrant and their ethnic and their religious and their community backgrounds, with the state that they were moving to. So it was quite common in the UK to develop ideas of hyphenated identities, British Black, British Pakistani, British Muslim, in a way in which the traditions of integration and the philosophies of incorporation in France were much more resistant to formally in terms of how you identify. But I think it also has to do partly with space, insofar as many of the people who moved to the UK moved from significant distances from the West Indies, from India, from East and West Africa, whereas the colonial history of France, is imagined, certainly the idea of the French majority and perhaps even the French state, as being on its border, in a way in which Britain could almost kind of forget about its empire, could tell a national story after the Second World War. And so, when you watch popular depictions of Britishness, you see films like Paddington, you tell this Windrush story of how London was a home for everybody. Well, it became a home for everybody through struggle, through protest as well, but also a remaking of common membership, a remaking of national identity, which is not without its problem, as we could tell in a number of controversies over the years.
Yes, and how much then is race and that colonial legacy still an issue when we think of relations between the dominant culture and the ethnic and religious minorities?
I think it has a legacy too. Just as Nabila has outlined of France, I think there is a continuity between then and now. It just hasn't manifested in similar levels of public violence and engagement with the state, which translates into the kinds of uprisings and the protests that we've seen in France. There have been episodes of that historically. Think of Toxteth, Bristol, of St. Paul's, of the Tottenham riots and so on. Britain has that history too, but I think partly because of the remaking of membership, the retelling of a story in which minoritized people could self-identify as British and therein change the idea of Britishness, and indeed Scottishness and Welshness and Englishness. I think the idea of them and us, the border, the boundary between majority and minority, isn't as fixed, I think, as it is in France.
Nabila, obviously, Nasar has mentioned there that citizenship was one of the kind of main issues. He mentioned these hyphenated identifications. Can you give us your thoughts? Is that the case with French-Algerians? Because many of us will have heard the term French-Algerians, but is that perhaps less commonly used or adopted?
Well, France is obsessed with Frenchness to the extent that there was once a Ministry of Immigration, Integration and National Identity. It lasted for 3 years up until 2010. And it launched a great debate on national identity in an attempt to codify what it means to be French. So the buzzwords that were assimilated to that debate were assimilation and indeed integration. But the ministry opened up an online platform for people to share their ideas. It was meant to be an intellectual debate to spark interesting points about, what it means to be French. And in fact, the website was flooded by comments such as France is for Christians, being French means eating pork and not wearing a burqa, for example. Mm-hmm. You can see the level of bigotry involved. Now, officially, the common denominator related to all those living in France, and indeed its overseas territories, is a very distinct form of republican identity, which implies that everybody has common values. And in that sense, the French model is quite unique because it asks immigrants to leave all their cultural and, dare I say, their religious inheritance at the point of entry. And everybody is meant to be molded into an identikit citizens. And descendants of immigrants, like myself, are also asked to leave their cultural baggage aside. And this is directly inherited from the French Revolution and the Enlightenment philosophy that underpinned it. And the new order was meant to be based on universal values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And in theory, Article 1 of the Constitution of the Fifth Republic states that the French nation is one, it's indivisible, it ensures equality before the law of all citizens without distinction of origin, race, and religion. Mm-hmm. But in practice, France's supposed republicanism has failed miserably to deliver the lofty promises of liberty, equality, fraternity for all. And for some, that means that the injustices are starker. In fact, it turns out that your race, your religion, and your origins do matter if that means that you are left behind.
Mm-hmm. Nasar, I'm interested to hear from you, and especially, when we're drawing parallels or contrasts and looking at the differences between Britain and France. We take Rishi Sunak, he's our First Minister, Hamza Yousaf is our First Minister. When we've celebrated the NHS or even the Olympics, the contribution of minority communities is always highlighted. How important are these things?
Well, profoundly, but there's two things in that. So in addition to the symbolic representation of difference in public life, so there not being a seeming contradiction between being Hindu and Prime Minister and Muslim and First Minister, I think those things are important. But I think as big an issue, if not bigger, are the impediments or the barriers to participation in society at all levels. I don't think the UK is free of discrimination and indeed structural and institutional racism, but the labour market participation, the levels of educational engagement, the nature and the composition of where people live and how they live is much better in the UK in terms of being able to move through education, through the labour market, and be socially mobile and live in amongst cheek by jowl amongst different communities. The residential segregation in France is often, organised by the state historically in a way in which it has a legacy now. That's not been the case in the UK. There are clusters and pockets of communities that live together for many of good reasons, but that's rarely to do with state planning. That has to do with occupational and labour market mobility. So the opportunities to be included in society in all those sectors, I think, is much better in the UK, even though there are a number of problems and impediments.
Interesting. Nabila, you've just finished writing your book, Fixing France, How to Repair a Broken Republic, which will be out in the UK this October. Can you briefly just give us a sense of what you think France needs to do to address some of the issues it's having?
Well, I couldn't agree with what Nasser just said anymore. And to give you an idea of taking Nanterre as a prime example of what's happening, the bidonvilles that were in Nanterre before have now turned into what the French call sensitive urban zones, which is, of course, a state jargon for areas of decrepit housing, high unemployment, and rampant discrimination, not least of all by the forces of law and order. And unlike countries like Britain, where integration and social mobility have been given a far higher priority, France's own former socialist Prime Minister Manuel Valls described the situation in the banlieue as a form of territorial, social, and indeed ethnic apartheid. And that needs to be sorted out. There are regular pledges that are made to pour millions of euros into improving those estates, but it really misses the point. What is required is for banlieue residents to be permitted to move into mainstream society and to be guaranteed equal opportunities there. In fact, they need to be treated equally as French citizens, just as the rest of the nation.
Nabila Ramdani and Nasar Meer, thank you both so much for your insights on this topic. And Nabila, congratulations on the book. We'll very much look forward to seeing that. Thank you both for joining me this morning.